Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. For those of you who are hoping to hear Katie Town and Rob Childs speak this evening, I'm afraid that Rob is unavailable, so it's quotes just Katie. However, hopefully you've all seen the publicity for tonight, and the aim is to give you all of the tools and information that you need to judge your first striking competition. Here in the Cambridge district, we have the Gibson Trophy, which is a locals inter-tower striking league. So we play quite friendly matches against other towers in our local area. And obviously with quite a few towers involved, that gives us quite a lot of judges to find. And the idea is that we wanted to put together a seminar to help people feel comfortable that they know how to prepare. You might think it's a bit odd for this local friendly striking league to get advice from one of the best judges in the game. Katie obviously judged the 2018 12 bell final. 2018? No, which one was it? We can cover that later. Yes, so yeah, obviously judging national 12 bell striking competition is a little bit different to our local 6 bell friendly, but hopefully all of the skills and advice that Katie has from building up to that will be really useful and relevant to us. So without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to Katie. Do submit any questions that you've got using the Q&A. And if you've got any technical issues, do use the chat feature and I'll see what I can do to help out. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Katie. Welcome.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. Right, we will now do some inelegant screen sharing.
Wonderful.
Hopefully, there we go, the magic of PowerPoint. So what I've been asked to talk about is how can you know whether you're ready to judge a striking competition? And I often feel that being asked to judge a striking competition is a really great honour, but kind of with those great honours also goes responsibility. So you kind of really need to know and feel that you're ready in order to do this. So most of you probably have got no idea who I am or where I ring or anything like that. I think Dave's very much overstated my expertise or my insight in this area. So I grew up in North Yorkshire and I rang at Northallerton since learnt in about 1989, end of the 80s. After going to university in London, I stayed down there for about another 15 years and rang in city centre places in London. And I'm now ringing at Leeds Minster, which is here, where I can hopefully go back to because I'm living in Wakefield at the moment, so I'm not getting to see that very much. I've rung in quite a few striking competitions myself, so I know what it's like on the other end, both local, regional, national, and I also have the pleasure of saying that I've rung in one international striking competition when the College Youths and the Cumberlands had a joint striking competition in Adelaide. So I can say that I was in the winning band for that, which not very many people have managed to do for an international competition. I've judged both local and national competitions, as Dave alluded to. But one of the things I've also got particularly good at is actually saying no to judging striking competitions. And I think pretty much every competition that I've judged, I've tried to turn down first on the basis that I didn't feel as though I had necessarily the right experience or that there were people who were better than me at it. So I know what it feels like when you're thinking, I've been asked to do this and I'm not sure that I can do it. I thought it'd be useful for me to tell you what's not in this webinar, so that then if that's what you were really wanting, you can sneak out of a virtual room now and at the moment, and I don't even know who's in here, so I won't be feeling at all aggrieved about it. So I've got no experience of either ringing in or judging the kind of call change competitions that happen down in Devon. And they go with very particular sorts of rules, and it does seem to be very serious. As I've got no experience of it, I'm not going to go into any of that. We're also not going to do any bell ringing listening tonight. It's going to be my voice. There's plenty of bits of recordings, and we'll come on to that later. but I didn't want to pick out someone's recording and share it and us all rip it to shreds, or say that it's brilliant, without getting all the ringers' permissions. So it just seemed easiest to keep this as a me talking. So those are the main things that I won't be covering. I'm also probably not going to cover much about the Strikeometer or technological assistance. I'm assuming that you are going to be judging something like local 6-bell or 8-bell competition, maybe the Gibson Trophy that Dave talked about, and that you'll be doing that without much technology behind you. Finally, just to say for housekeeping, I am on my own. There is no Rob here, but there is a loud cat that could well come on screen. So if I fight off the cat, that's Charlie Cat. So what actually the content of the talk? So striking competition marking is quite different to actual general listening. And this is often where striking competition judges get torn apart by what's often called the churchyard judges. Because those people who are listening outside, or just when you're generally listening to ringing, they're generally just listening for ringing that sounds nice. So that takes into account speed, consistency, general impression. They often take into account quite a lot method accuracy or inaccuracy. And to be strictly honest, they only listen to some bits of it because they'll be talking or getting put off at some points. So they don't actually listen to the whole of the piece. This doesn't stop them having a view. What judging is doing is it's taking a much more objective listen to the piece of ringing. And what you're being asked to do is judge for faults. Now, lots of people talk a lot about faults. And frankly, the thing to admit is they're different to different people's ears. There's a few categories and there's no general terminology, but here's my go at it. So you can have a fault that's a clip. It's generally caused by someone who knows where they're meant to be, where they should be, but there's just an inaccuracy about where they place the bell. Then there's crunches, which are more significant dropped blows, or it could be a method mistake that someone's got away with quite well. And there could be blangs, which are direct hits. So they're almost always a method mistake or a really bad error. So those sorts of different levels of mistakes that you can have. And these can happen at lead as well. So if a band's ringing with an open handstroke lead, and if someone actually has a closed handstroke lead, that is actually as 100% wrong as if they were aiming for third place and they rang in second place instead. Difference being one of those things ends up with a big blang and the other one just ends up with a smooth bit of ringing but without a handstroke gap. So that's something to be aware of. What you've also got is you've got the opposite of all of those. So you've got gaps, and they can happen in the same sort of degree, your clips, your crunches, your blangs. But what you can have with gaps is that actually the band can adjust around people. So what you'd be doing in a touch where you merrily make sure that you kind of avoid each other can become much more of a technique. And this is what I put here, how good bands trick judges. Well, they play dodgems. And that can be much hard if they keep the overall framework. So the length of the change isn't expanding and contracting significantly, then actually a good band and an inexperienced judge can have a bit of, well, a good day for the band, a bad day for the judge, where people are just avoiding each other. So what can you do to get your ear into check about what you think different gradation faults are? So obviously, as and when we finally get back to doing some bell ringing, every time you're not ringing, you can sit and practice picking out faults. Now, I'm saying this before we go into how you write down things about faults, because actually I think sitting in the corner with a notebook and a pen is probably a bit of a step too far. But what you're trying to get at is so that you've got your own consistent definition about what's a clip, what's a blang, and what are the gradations in between. And what you want to be able to do is apply those definitions really consistently over however many pieces of ringing that you're being asked to judge. So what you want to do is be listening to lots and lots of pieces of ringing. Clearly at the moment, when we're not in a scenario where we're going to be ringing, and probably not for quite some time, there's loads of recordings on YouTube. And the great thing about if you do that is you can start to test yourself about whether you're being consistent or not. So listen to a number of pieces of ringing on YouTube and actually mark the faults, and do that over a sort of contained period of time, so that you're giving yourself an experience of what it's like to try and be consistent over a competition period. And then ideally come back to the same touches of ringing, probably in a different order. That would be a good test. And maybe if you want to be really strict on yourself, get someone else to mess it up so you don't know which one's which. And then mark it again and see if you're getting to the point where you're getting approximately the same level of faults and you're getting those pieces in the same order. When you're getting to that, you've probably got your own definition about what is a fault, what isn't, and what are the gradations. So you're clearly feeling much more confident than I ever do at this point, and you're willing to say yes to judging that striking competition. So I really think that preparation is key to lots of things in life. And this of judging striking competitions will be one of those things as well. Often, if it's a local competition, you will pretty much be asked to do it alone. Now, I think if it's something like the Gibson Trophy where you're just marking one band against another, that's probably completely fine. It's not so long to concentrate for. If you're being asked to judge an area competition, say a local branch competition where you've got to listen to 6 or 8 teams or maybe even more, you're probably going to want to get yourself someone else to help with you, whether it's an assistant to add up your faults and to time the pieces, or you might want to co-judge someone to actually mark alongside you. What you've got to be aware of is, of course, that person could be as flaky as Rob, and you might end up doing it on your own anyway. You'll also want to make sure you've got some really practical things. You don't necessarily know where you're going or how well prepared it's going to be when you get there. You definitely want to be taking with you paper, pens, pencils, loads of them, pencils with pencil sharpeners as well. Something to rest on. Never presume that you will actually have a table. Hopefully, the good people will be planning to feed and water you, but I always take plenty of snacks and water, so energy levels are within my own control. And you will want some level of technology with you. Definitely a calculator or PC with Excel on it or calculator, but you might also want to have a recording device. So on the day, what do you need to do? Well, you need to arrive at the tower sufficiently early so that the organiser does not look stressed. This will also help you as well, because it means that you've got time to settle into your judging location, which hopefully will have been suggested by that lovely local organiser who talked you into it in the first place. Ideally, you'll ask for a trial ring. This so that you can stay in the judging location, so that you can make sure that you can hear all the bells clearly, and can just check that there's not one that overdominates in the whole scenario. Some judges like to go and have a ring to get a feel for the bells. It's not essential. It sometimes feels to me as though that's a bit of an extra test for you. You feel like you've got to be perfect in that bit of ringing, and you're frankly already quite stressed. But some people really like to do that. Now, the judging position also needs to be away from where any other distractions are. So if you can be away from a main road with sirens going past, all the better. But what you really, really need to be is somewhere where you're away from all the bell ringers who are gossiping. So you don't want to be able to hear all the ringers. You certainly don't want to be able to see the tower door or the church door to see who's going in and out. Ideally, you don't want to see anyone, so that you can't go, oh, if I've just seen X, that means that band can't be ringing. Fundamentally, your job will be easier if you're feeling comfortable, but it will be by far easier if you can actually hear the bells clearly. And this may sound completely stupid. In fact, I think it's going to sound completely stupid. I have heard of one judging team who judged a local six-bell competition with Radio 5 live on because it was an important football match. The people are trying really hard to do their best in ringing. So definitely don't give them any reason to doubt that you've paid plenty of attention to them. Now, one of the things to make sure you've got to hand, either in advance or on the day from your local organiser, is a copy of the rules. Now, most of these things you're not going to need to worry about. If it's a Sunday service band, from listening to them, you can't tell whether they all rang for Sunday services at that tower. But the rules will give you some things that will impact your marking. So fundamentally, what sort of competition is it? Hopefully you know this, but are you expecting to decide which out of two pieces is better, which isn't so bad, unless they're very closely matched, it's probably going to be quite easy to work out which one's which. Or are you being asked to mark between a larger number of bands? The rules will hopefully tell you whether rounds are marked or not, and if they don't, you need to ask the organiser. I'd say if the rules are silent and the organiser can't tell you what the normal custom was, I would assume that rounds are not marked. So you start from the first either call change or method change, and the only rounds that you mark is the last row when they go into rounds at the end. But hopefully the rules will give you some idea. You'll need to know whether the bands can ring different touches. So do they have to ring the same method and the same touch, or can they ring all sorts of different things? So can they ring call changes, doubles, or minor? Now that all becomes a bit difficult, because then you need to think, how much of it do you mark? Do you mark a set number of changes, or do you mark everything that they choose to ring? Again, hopefully the rules will help you on this. The one thing that, and also you need to find out what sort of results you're announcing. If it is a mixture between call changes and method ringing, and there's maybe an overall winner, do you need to announce a call change winner as well as a method ringer? How is that dealt with? Because that won't impact how you mark, but it will impact on how you announce things at the end. And then the final thing, which is something in the rules that judges often do have to monitor, is if there's any set time frames. So if a band has to be starting ringing by a certain time, or to start changes by a certain time, often it's the judges in the judging room who are expected to mark off that. Now, it might seem super simple, but there are two other vital things that you need to find out. First of which is something from the local organiser, which is how many teams are expected. It will feel like it is going on for an eternity if you're judging a local or a regional competition where you've got a branch striking competition with, say, 10 teams ringing. It just feels like it's going on forever. To manage your own energy levels and your own concentration levels, you want to have some clarity about how far through you are, even just to go, right, we've hit the hump, we're into the last half. It also would be rather ridiculous if you started packing up your things and stopping listening when the last band starts ringing. And that has been a horror story that I've heard from other people. Luckily, never happened to me. The other thing that you want to find out, again, it might be in the rules, or it might be something that you ask your local organiser, is what's the signal that the bands will give you so that you know that they're ready to start. In the National 12 bell, it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and so you know to listen out for that. Listen out really carefully for whatever that signal is, particularly as the day moves on. If you are judging alone, or you're judging with a co-judging, you're having to add up your own faults, by the time you've thought about the ringing, added up your faults, you'll be really surprised. You've probably used up most, if not all, of the practice time of the next band. So really be alert to that. So we're back into how do you actually practically mark faults, and how do you deal with gradations? So I've added an extra gradation in here. We've got clip, crunch, clash, blang. And what you need is a system about how you're going to mark each piece of ring against each other, so that you know which one's best, really. That's all we're aiming for. And most people end up doing some sort of numerical scale, applying a maximum number of faults to a row. So a row isn't just, it was clean, it scored no faults, or if there was something wrong with it, it had one. Because actually, the more you listen to ringing, the more you'll realise that most rows have got something wrong with them. So lots of judges score out of 3 or out of 4. So you score 0 for a clean row, a 1 would be sort of a small clip or a small gap, 2 would be a crunch, 3 would be a newly instated clash, and 4 would be a blang or 2 or more clashes going on in there. If you're marking out of 3, those sections just get smaller. If I'm going to mark this way, I like marking out of 4 because it means that I've got quite a lot of gradation, and also I never really want to give people 4s, so it's got to be pretty bad before people get 4s. And I think if I was marking out of 3, I'd be unwilling to give people 3s unless it was really bad, and then you're just marking between, it's either clean or it's a 1 or a 2. Anyway, different people find different ways of working, and I have judged with people who've only marked a row out of 2, but they've often given their lowest blemish, their tiny clip or their tiny gap, a half fault. So in many ways, they're just cheating. They're marking out of the same number as the rest of us. And it really, in many ways, it doesn't matter what system you're using, because we'll come on to what you mark and what you announce not necessarily being the same thing. Basically, so long as you stick with your definition and carry on using it and do it consistently, you will get to the right result as long as you can listen properly. What you really don't want to do is, if you're judging with someone else, that they then will, if they're judging a different way, so you add up team 1 and you've got twice as many faults as them, do not start adjusting what you're doing. If everyone carries on doing exactly what they were doing and staying very strict to that, everything will be fine. And we'll come on to how you deal with someone having twice as many faults later. So you're going to need to record your view. Each row happens, you have a view. Say you're using my system, it's either 0 or up to 4. You need to record it. If it's a touch where people are ringing exactly the same number, exactly the same touch, you can get a grid printed out of that touch, and you can mark against the end of each row. If not, I'd advocate squared paper, ideally with the number of changes that you're going to have to mark if it's a set number. If it's just the amount of time the ring call changes for, just square paper. And you make a mark in a box for every single row. So I'd put a dot in my box if it's a clean row, just so that I know that I've actually marked that row. And then I put the numbers. Some people use proper numbers. I'd use tally chart because it means that I don't need to remember if the starter row had a bit of a clip in it, I'll give them a 1. And then, it either expands or not, depending on how clean or otherwise the row is. So then what you do is, at the end of each piece of paper, at the end of each touch, you add up how many things you've got on your sheet, so you know how many faults there are. What I'd advocate doing before that, because it does take quite a long time to add up faults if you're having to do them yourselves, is if you're judging with someone else, discuss the piece of ringing straight away and scribble down your thoughts, your random words about what you felt, things that stood out, both good and bad. And if you're not judging with someone else, if you're doing that on your own, then I'd make sure that I scribble down those thoughts straight away anyway, so that you've got your sort of gut reaction view before you know exactly how many faults you've got. Of course, you'll have an idea because you'll see whether your paper looks empty or whether it looks very full, but it will give you a useful idea, and you'll come back to these comments later. As I say, in an ideal world, you'll have a little assistant who will tot up these faults for you, but if not, you're going to be very busy doing adding up. So then that happens, sometimes feeling ad infinitum, until you get to the end and the last touch has finished. And this is where everyone else goes off to focus on the ringing tea or goes to the beer garden. I'm afraid to say you've still got quite a lot of work to do at this point. So if you were judging with someone else, this is the point where you need to combine your score. Now, this could be super easy. If you all agree on the order, both agree on the order, you could just choose the chief judge's marks, but it doesn't always happen that easily. And as I said, lots of people have different gradations. What I would mark as a 2, you might mark as a 3. By the time we get to the end, you've got 50% more faults than me. So if we add yours and my faults together, then your scores is weighted higher than mine is, and that can influence what the result is. So I'm afraid to say that we need to do some maths at this time, and it's time for some what I call hardish sums, because we need to normalise the marks between each other. And this is where I suggest that a calculator, or even better Excel, would be a really great thing to have at your fingertips. I have shamelessly nicked this from a book that's written by Simon Linford that I'll show you later on. And you may need to move where you've got the little screen showing me if you can't see the final column, which I'm just going to do now on my screen. So we've got Judge 1, or Judge X, who's had quite a lenient sort of scoring, and he or she has scored the total out of all these bands, A to F, 302. Judge Y, more of the stickler, stronger marking position, has scored from all 690. So what we do now is that we add up, we've added up all of our scores, and what we take is, we've taken, I'm going to actually properly look at this so I read it back to you, because I'd hate to get the maths wrong. So you're multiplying Judge X's by the ratio of Judge Y over Judge X is totals. And by doing that, then you've got Judge X normalised underneath. So that's as though Judge X's proportions had all been applied, but to a total of 690. We then can take Judge Y and Judge X together. We've got their average number of faults there, and then we get their position. Simon explains it a bit better in the book, and I did read it twice. So now what you've got is, you know, your results. Here we know that Team B has won and Team D has come last. So what we need to do is we need to think about both comments and marks. 12 Bell judging guidance, last time I did it, has got some information in it that says that ringers are sensitive souls and that judges should be aware of this when giving their results. And I think that if that applies to people who are competing in the National 12 Bell competition, it definitely applies to local bands who have worked very hard for their local branch striking competition. So this is where you'll take all of your comments that you wrote about each band and you can turn them into something useful. Now, ideally, this is going to include something they did well and something to work on so that it can be constructive. And I'm sure many of you will have seen this feedback sandwich: positive feedback, some constructive criticism, and then positive feedback to close. Everyone's doing this as a hobby, even you, even though it won't feel like you are doing it as a hobby at this point. But try and make people feel very positive about taking part. You'll also want to, well, I think it's a good idea to read out the comments in the order that you're going to give them, and that will be the order that the teams ran. But I also find it really helpful, if you can, to read out your comments from the team that's come last through to the team that's come first, to try and make sure that what you're saying about bands is telling the story. You're not giving significantly better comments to someone who came fourth than someone who won it. but in an ideal world, trying to keep a little bit of the suspense going. You'll also, at this point, need to consider what you're actually going to announce in terms of number of faults. If you've scored up to 4 faults per row, it could be really disheartening to get a number of faults that is significantly more than the number of rows you have run. You might have a competition where the rules or conventions govern this. For instance, the national 12-hour competition now gives a percentage score. The youth competition awards grades. I've heard about one that gave gold, silvers and bronzes. What you could do, if it's within your remit, you can decide to do any of those things. Or more conventionally in local branch contests, you could adjust your faults. So you could decide that the number that the winning band should have, so say that's 10, 20, somewhere in that sort of region, to dictate that they were significantly the best. And then you adjust all of your scores in proportion so that hopefully the people who came last or nearer the bottom aren't feeling too depressed about the whole scenario. We then get on to giving your results. On the left, the lovely Dee Dee, and me looking on in awe, as always, at David Durnley. I think most of it is about being audible. You'll have a lot of rabble going on, whether it's at a ringing tea or whether everyone's been in the beer garden all afternoon. But you've got a few things that you need to get across. Now, the convention is that you start with an introduction. And here you talk about having had a nice day and having been very glad and honoured to be asked to judge. If you spent the afternoon sat in a cramped car with the window open so that you can actually hear the bells and rain blowing in, you might find that it would have been actually better to write this introduction before you set off. And I tend to do that actually because you know kind of what you want to say. You want to say thank you to the person who brought you the tea and the cake, but you just don't know what their name is yet. And you do want to say encouraging things about thank you to everyone who rang. You can add in a little bit of nuance about how it was either standard was incredibly high or it's clear they're very challenging bells. If you can say the bells are nice, the locals always love that. If you can't, better not to say anything on that. But what you want to do is get everyone infused so that they feel that they were glad that they took part and that they'll want to take part again. Then it's the comments section. So the comments are read out in order of bands who rang. And so you still don't know which is which at this point. If you do have any influence over the local organiser, try and get them to call the bands A letters rather than numbers. Because if they say band 1, by the time you get into results, band 1, 5th, it all gets a bit confusing. So if you can influence them to call them letters, I find that a lot easier. And then your job's nearly done when you have announced that band B won and came first. It'll be announced what their local organiser will say, what band it was. If there's a trophy, you get to hand it over, smiling people, everything's good. It's then after results. So your job is now done, but you have one more important task to do. And it's not drinking tea and it's not drinking beer, but it is to stay really confident. You've announced it, someone's got the trophy, someone's found out they're last. You may get feedback, to put it nicely, from churchyard judges or from people who rang in teams. You listened objectively to the faults. They didn't. They stood around outside, or they, even if they think they listened, they didn't listen in quite the conditions that you were. They probably didn't sit there with pen and paper. So you need to stay confident. What you also need to do is keep your papers and any recordings you may have made. If you did want to make recordings during the day to go back to listen to stuff as part of your marking, keep all of those to yourself, destroy them, recycle them as soon as possible. But you've made your decision, nothing's going back from it. So stay confident, be nice to people. And if someone's being a real pain, go and find someone else to talk to, which is probably a lesson for life in general. So other resources. This is a Central Council publication. When Dave asked me to do this talk, likewise to my normal approach to judging striking competitions, I thought I couldn't possibly do that. And then I started to mull it over and thought, well, maybe I've got a few things to say. And then I thought I'd better check that they're actually right. So this little book, it's not very thick. It's a really good and quick read. It goes into all sorts of things in more detail than I've been able to do here. And it only costs £3.50. And because I didn't have one to hand, but I do now, I can guarantee you that Central Council Bookstore by Barbara Wheeler is still dispatching in these points. It's only £3.50, and if you want to find out more, I would recommend it. But really, in summary, if you can pick out your own bell when you are ringing and adjust your own striking without being told repeatedly, with practice, you can judge a striking competition and you might actually find that you enjoy it. So I think that's all I plan to say. I've spotted a couple of Q&A things coming in, but I haven't looked at them. So Dave, will you work your magic?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been really good, and hopefully everyone at home did get the message that the natural reaction when you're asked this question is to think, oh, there's no way I can do this. But obviously Katie is proof to the contrary that after that thought subsides, actually you can do it. So thank you very much for the talk. I was just going to say, do please enter questions in the Q&A interface if you have them. It's a great time while we've got Katie available to talk to us. I was going to say, that you mentioned in passing sort of, what happens if you're packing up as the last band starts to ring. I think, you can imagine lots of disaster scenarios, such as, there's, you mentioned staying away from roads, but I've heard of a thunderstorm starting during a piece which obliterates most of the ringing, and and you also mentioned keeping alert, and I've heard of at least one time when the judge managed to miss the signal, and so have you got any words of wisdom at all for what happens in these kind of disaster scenarios where you're perhaps not sure whether the test piece has started, or or you're confused as to what's going on? Have you got any words of advice for people out there?
Yeah, I mean, if they're within your own power, try and avoid them. So do try and listen out as hard as you possibly can for the signal. If you do miss part of the ringing for whatever reason, for natural instances like thunder, lightning, that sort of thing, you could look at how much you managed to mark, how much you listened to clearly, and again, adjust proportionally. So either take out that percentage of other people's touches, or probably easier, do a multiplier on that one touch, assuming that it would be a bit consistent. None of it is particularly ideal, because that bit could have been the most perfect lead that they ever rang. It may have been completely out of kilter with the rest of the ringing, but unless you're going to get the band to ring again, if you've completely missed it, or you've missed more than 50% of the piece, then that's probably the better thing to do. But unless that's the case, then you're probably better to do some proportional adjusting. You then do have the question about how honest or otherwise you are with the bands. If it's something where it was due to really heavy rain and you were judging in the Vicar's Conservatory, and you're telling people you were judging in the conservatory, people will know. So you may as well explain what you've done. If it's that you missed the signal, but you're pretty confident that you only missed, till the treble, less than half a lead, and you've adjusted proportionally, you may feel that that can be something that can just be kept between you. Again, one of these things is about exuding confidence where you possibly can. So if you're going to do some proportional adjusting, and you felt that that was a confident and fair thing to do, if it was due to your own fault, you're probably better not to tell people, because it will only give a lack of confidence, a lack of certainty in all of the results that you've presented. Actually, that's one thing I didn't put in the talk, but you would think that if you separated bands by not very many faults, that would give the ringing community confidence, because you had a small margin between them. Actually, what it tends to do is ringers tend to take that you weren't sure, and you're not sure on the order. So when you've decided on your faults, and when you've normalised them, you've then proportionally scaled them in whatever way you're going to do, if you find that two bands are separated by next to nothing, and you're confident on the order, you should separate them out a little bit in terms of numbers. And if you're not confident on the order, make them be in equal place, unless it's winning. Probably generally best not to have joint winners.
Yeah, very good point. So we've got a couple of questions in at the moment. So Angus says, thank you very much for a fantastic talk, but says, obviously you've concentrated on sort of, how should one say, the almost the numerical accuracy of the ringing, and thinks that it's maybe a bit sad that there's no sort of artistic merit given to the performance. I know it's a big debate and we can't cover it in any detail here at all, really, but what's your feedback on that?
In some ways, that's the limitation of the striking competition ways as it's generally set up, and generally within the rules. The rules are that the judges shall mark faults. People have got around it by expanding judging teams. So I've known it. I haven't judged on one of these myself, but I've known people have a certain number of judges who are marking faults. That could be one or two. And then maybe having another judge who's just listening for the artistic merit, and they sit back on a nice cushion and watch everyone else beaver away with their pens and papers. And then that will feed in to the result. I think that's kind of fine if the people who are adding up the faults and the person who's doing the artistic merit hit kind of the same order, or at least the same winner, then I think that's absolutely fine. But it becomes a bit problematic if the artistic merit disagrees with the faults. I don't really have an answer about how you can combine those two things. And with Angus, I kind of agree, because actually you can have ringing that sounds really good outside, but is just littered with little inaccuracies, and so will score badly. Whereas a piece of ringing that didn't sound anywhere like as nice outside, but is actually just clean throughout, or nearly clean, and it could be because they're doing that Dodgem effect. Now, I keep on thinking good bands do manage to trick judges with Dodgem effects, but that may not sound as nice outside, but it's actually much cleaner when you're actually objectively marking whether it's a fault or not.
Great. Greg Pierce says, I think I could manage to count up faults, but sounding vaguely intelligent whilst giving comments on the ringing sounds a lot more difficult. How little can you get away with?
You can get away with very little often. It's not as bad as it sounds, because especially if you're judging with someone else, even if that person's also quite inexperienced. About maybe 17 years ago, me and my sister judged a local striking competition together, and I wouldn't say either of us were particularly experienced at that time, but we, because we could discuss the touches after each one, and we scribbled down what we felt, when you came back to writing the comments, you could easily construct something, because we'd written down things that we really liked about it, things that we didn't. You can also, you've got to remember that you're giving feedback to real life people. So if it's been a great piece of ringing by the front five bells, they were ringing doubles, and the tenor was consistently so, and so there was a gap, half blow gap from the tenor each row, that bell's going to have incurred significant amounts of faults. And so you could show your listening skills by pointing that out. But probably if they're ringing doubles and the tenor's consistently slow, they've got a very inexperienced person on the tenor. So instead, you might want to talk about the change varying in length or something like that. So you just have to think it through a little bit. If you really want to say very little, ringers will expect you to say something, but you can get away with quite bland things. So this touch was one of the quickest of the day and improved somewhat towards the end, or one of the quickest of the day, and it sort of seemed to gather too much speed, and I think the ringers tripped over each other. But actually, just towards the end was a glimmer of, it was starting to get more confident. Yeah, that could be enough. You haven't really said anything in particular. And it doesn't quite hit the feedback sandwich, because apart from don't speed up, guys, you've not given them too much to work on, but it would be enough.
That's a very interesting point that you've mentioned speed there, that we have a question in from John Coppendale, who says, some judges give peel speed for each band. How important do you think that is in the feedback?
I think it's only important if you're going to get it right. So in a local competition, actually, if it's a 6-bell competition, it's kind of irrelevant. It's probably a Sunday service touch. Peel speed isn't particularly relevant there, but you may want to still time the pieces so that you can say which was slowest, which was quickest, because that will give you something for your comments. If you give peel speeds and they are wrong, because some people do pay attention to how long their touch took, and they've had the whole afternoon to calculate what their peel speed was, then if you give it and it's wrong, people will not trust your other results or other aspects of your results, and they'll have more reason to talk to you. So I would only give speeds if I felt super, super confident that they would be right. And the good bits about when I've judged national competition, Dave, is I get to trust you on that occasion.
That's true. And just to comment on the Gibson, I personally would recommend for people to try and get peel speeds out, just because it's a really friendly environment to get practice at doing it, because it is difficult, and especially if you're on your own. Yeah, I'd say Gibson is a wonderful proving ground for all of these techniques. So give it a go, see if you can do it. If you can't do it, then you know that you shouldn't try it in the future. We've got a question from Stephen Theobald, say, how do you stop yourself from listening to the band's practice and effectively starting the judging from there?
It can be challenging. It gets less if you're doing one of these competitions where you are judging multiple pieces of ringing, then it does get significantly easier as the day goes on, because you've just got such a volume of things to do by that stage. You've got comments on the previous piece, you've got adding up, you've hopefully got a bit of cake to eat, and you might need to go to the loo. That's probably enough for a practice piece. But I mean, that might sound a bit like I'm avoiding the question. Practice pieces do give you some useful information. It can give you a little bit of a benchmark about hopefully what the band's going to ring. So if it is one of these mixed competitions where it's chord changes, doubles or minor, it gives you a bit of an idea what you're going to expect as what's coming along for the test piece. It is really important that you don't start marking it, but so long as if you are doing it by actually recording faults, however much you've listened to it and gone, oh, this should be really exciting, this sounds like a good band, or I think they're going to struggle a bit. That's not necessarily unhelpful, so long as you start listening with clean ears and without any preconceptions when they actually get going.
Yeah, and in particular for the Gibson, you often get the judges giving a comparative between the practice and the test piece, not least because in this setting, the bands quite often want to know whether the things that they've discussed between the practice and the test piece actually resulted in the change that they wanted, because it's, the whole point of the Gibson is that it's as much practice for the bands being in a striking competition situation as it is for the judges. And so I think that our local trophy is potentially a special case where it is apt to listen with a slightly more critical ear to the practice, because feedback to the bands on how they're coping with the situation is potentially very useful. Philip and Sheila George ask if the test piece is, for example, 120 rows and the team doesn't manage to complete 120, what do you do? Do you go back to your local organiser to ask for guidance?
So I assume we're not completing 120 rows. Well, there's two ways of that, isn't there? So there's call changes where the person who was calling it thinks that they have, because it's felt like it's gone on for quite a long time, but actually you in marking it have realised that they haven't completed it, in which case then I think I would talk to the local organiser. Unfortunately, if it's that they haven't completed 120 rows because they've fired out or had to stop for some other reason, I don't know of any striking competition where that's not within the rules, but they're then unfortunately disqualified. So that usually the scenario is if you don't get to the end of a touch for whatever reason, for ill health or for fire out, for anything other than mechanical reasons, then you're unfortunately disqualified. And judges can decide on what they do. You wouldn't announce a mark for them because they're disqualified and they didn't complete the piece, but you probably would like to give them some sort of comments. So a promising start, but unfortunately 2/3 of the way through the piece, there was a major error that was then compounded by another error. And unfortunately, this band then had to stop, which was disappointing because it just showed so much promise. And you'll probably find that you slightly overcompensate on your feedback because there'll be a few people who'll be feeling a bit rubbish about the fact that they didn't manage to get to the end anyway. So you'll want to give them as much encouragement as you possibly can.
Yeah, perfect. We've got a question in from Anand who says, what was the name of the book from the Central Council again?
So it is called Judging Striking Competitions, and it's been written by Simon Linford. You can get it on the Central Council website in their shop. Lovely Barbara Wheeler up in somewhere Newcastle-ish way is very much still working as Central Council Dispatch Central at the moment, and so it's only £3.50, and I found it quite an enjoyable read when I read it in my garden. And I think it, hopefully a bit like this talk, it will hopefully make you go away feeling more confident that you were more prepared than you actually thought you were.
Yeah. Luke Smith says, what's your most happy memory from judging striking competitions?
I think actually the really nice bits are when you get to see the joy on the people's faces who've won, and you get to hand over the trophy. There's also, as long as you pick who you're judging well, judging with well, then actually the banter within the judging room can also be really happy memories, but often that's got to sort of stay in the judging room and isn't necessarily the bit that you can talk to people about. I would also say the bit about handing over trophies, it means that it's all over and you can then relax a bit, because normally by that time I'm feeling a bit fraught and a bit exhausted.
And along similar lines, what was the first striking competition that you judged?
So the first competition I judged was a local, I think, 6-bell competition out in Kent somewhere. And it was one where I got there and I said, right, so lots of the things that were in the preparation, and where were we judging from? And they went, well, we thought you could judge from your car. I thought, well, it's a good job I didn't come by train, isn't it? And then had to find a map because it was a long time ago. So had to find a map to lean on as I sat in the car with the window open, watching ringers walk past on the pavement. So, you know, it's not like I've done very many competitions, but that one was a bit of a baptism by fire to start with.
Excellent. Right. Well, I think we've drawn to the end of the questions. Ian Hamilton writes a really marvellous description of preparation, the task, and being confident with your decision. Thanks so much for your time. And I'd just like to echo that. I know that it's a really tough gig, being asked to talk into a empty microphone for half an hour and then answer all sorts of strange questions that get thrown at you. But we're really, really grateful to everyone who's helped us put on these seminars or webinars during lockdown. Next week, we'll be inviting Will Bosworth to talk about zones and pathways. So that's basically about learning in ringing, and we're looking forward to that very much. That's next Wednesday, and links will be available on the Cambridge District Facebook page and email list. So it just remains me to say thank you once again to Katie. Very glad to have had you along tonight, and thank you so much for your talk.
So,
all right, cheers. Thank you all. All right, cheers. Good night.